Hello, everybody. My name is Tim Merino from the Game Innovation Lab at New York University, and I'll be presenting our paper, Making New Connections, LLMs as Puzzle Generators for the New York Times Connections Word Game. So quick show of hands, how many of you here have played with or are familiar with the Connections Word Game? Okay, really good amount. For those of you not familiar, we'll do a quick recap of the game. So Connections is a word puzzle that's published daily by the New York Times on their website. And each puzzle consists of 16 words in a grid. Your goal as a player is to separate these 16 words into 4 groups of 4, where all 4 words in a group are connected by some kind of unifying theme or connection. So on the right here, we have a half-solved puzzle, where one of the groups is filled to excess with the words cram, jam, pack, stuff. We also have rooms in a house, bedroom, den, kitchen, and study. And then the other 8 words are unsolved. So within the puzzle, there are 4 groups with 4 different colors. In ascending order of difficulty, yellow is the most straightforward. Then we have green, blue, and finally purple being the trickiest. So some of these clues require you to think in like really weird ways to solve, and that's kind of the beauty of the puzzle. So you can see a very straightforward category here will be marine mammals. You have dolphin, manatee, otter, and seal. When you look at these words and you see dolphin and manatee together, the first thing you're going to think of probably is some kind of sea creature. On the other hand, or the other end of the spectrum, you have this category, which is kind of infamous, countries when A is added. So you can see the words chin, cub, malt, tong. When you add an A to the end of these words, you get a country, China, Cuba, Malta, etc. So this is kind of what makes connections so fun, is these really like not straightforward ways of connecting words. So the TLDR of this paper is that we're going to use GPT-4 to generate new connections word puzzles. We're going to test out how good our puzzles are by conducting a user study where we compare them head to head with the real published puzzles. We find that our LLM generated puzzles were ranked similarly in terms of difficulty, creativity, and enjoyment by human playtesters. So what makes connections tricky for PCG? Well, if it wasn't, I wouldn't have written a paper about it. So let's start by defining like the core rules that define a valid connections puzzle. So as I mentioned, you have 16 words. These 16 words are grouped into 4 groups of 4. Each word has to logically and truthfully fit under its like connection theme. For example, like China couldn't fit into a category called countries that start with J. And each word is going to be used only once in one group, and there's one unique solution. So one way of grouping these 16 words into 4 groups of 4. So we have this like recipe for a valid connections puzzle. The problem is that this defines a nearly infinite space of puzzles. So you can think of any way to connect 4 words. Think of 4 words. Do this 4 times, slap them together, you have a puzzle. The problem is it's just not going to be very fun to solve. There's no challenge involved. The problem we're running into is that we don't have a recipe for making a good puzzle, a puzzle on par with the New York Times connections. Unlike other games, like the New York Times crossword, for example, there's not a lot of guides or guidelines written down anywhere on how to make a puzzle challenging and fun. And of course, if we want to prompt an LLM to generate a puzzle, we kind of need to distill this recipe down into a single prompt. We need to instruct the LLM what to do. So any good puzzle game needs to challenge the player. So we know that a good connections puzzle is a challenging connections puzzle. So we first start by investigating what makes a connections puzzle challenging. Why is it tricky to solve? And this is because there are words in the puzzle that kind of trick you into making an incorrect guess. And we identified 2 distinct ways that this happens in the puzzles that the New York Times puts out. We call these 2 ways intentional overlap and false groups. So intentional overlap, this is the term we use when we have a category that is actually a part of the puzzle solution, but it seems like it could fit more than 4 words. Remember, a group can only contain 4 words. So for example, we have these 5 words: bulldozer, crane, jackhammer, paver, and hoist. And it's pretty clear that one of our categories is going to be construction machinery. The problem is we don't know which 4 of these 5 words are going to go into that group. So if our puzzle shakes out like this, we can see that crane, which belongs to the flying animals category, is kind of overlapping in meaning with this construction machinery category. So that's what we're calling intentional overlap. The puzzle creator has overlapped a double meaning of one of these words. We also have false groups. This is when you have words that seem connected, but they aren't actually part of a puzzle solution. Some people call this like a red herring group. So for example, if you have these 4 words in your puzzle: zoom, lens, shutter, and aperture, it might jump out to you that these are all like camera terms or photography terms. If our puzzle actually shakes out like this, where zoom is a digital communication platform, a shutter is a window covering, etc., we would say this photography terms group that might jump out to you is a false group because it's not actually a true solution to this puzzle. So the naive approach to generating connections puzzles is we can try and write down every rule we can think of from being game players ourselves to make a New York Times quality connections puzzle. And we have GPT generate one. Sounds easy. You end up with a very, very long prompt. And this is actually a truncated version of the prompts we tried. And the result is bad puzzles. It's very hard to distill this many rules into a prompt and have your LLM adhere to all of them at once. I think anyone who's kind of tried to do this with LLMs knows the more rules you put in, it's going to end up breaking one of them. So this recipe for a good connections puzzle is a bit too complicated to distill into a single prompt. Adding on to this, GPT-4, at least the checkpoint we used, doesn't even know what the game is. So we not only have to explain all these like intangible aspects of good puzzle generation, we have to explain what the game is in the first place, because the model checkpoint that we used has a knowledge cutoff before the connections puzzle was released. So our solution to this problem is that instead of trying to explain the entire game in a single prompt, let's break it down into more manageable chunks, into smaller tasks that we know an LLM is capable of. So we're giving small task-specific prompts that don't require all this domain-specific knowledge and knowledge of connections and what makes it good. So we're going to do this by creating a generative pipeline consisting of language model agents that are all working in different roles to create a puzzle. So each step of our pipeline is going to generate one group, which we're defining as like a category or the connection between words, and then a pool of words that belong to that category. And then we can run this multiple times to generate 4 groups for a puzzle. In order to incorporate these 2 different difficulty types I mentioned, we're going to tweak our prompts and our steps slightly, but mostly using the same framework. So here's some of the examples of the way we're using language model agents to do this. We have our proposal agent. This is a large language model that's kind of doing like the creativity of puzzle creation. It's coming up with a category that it thinks is cool, and it's going to think of 8 words that could belong to it. So for example, we have our proposal LM agent, we pass in our prompt, and it's going to generate flying animals with bat, sparrow, and then crane. We then have a grouping agent, which is going to take this pool of 8 words and figure out ways to group them into groups of 4 under that category. We're going to do this based on word similarity. So here we're actually using an embedding model. If we take our 8 words that were proposed by our proposal agent in the previous step, we're going to create all possible combination of 4 words, and then calculate their pairwise cosine similarity, average that over the group, and order these groups. So remember, there's this yellow to purple difficulty color grading. And so we have the most similar words. If you think sparrow, crow, eagle, and hawk, these words are all obviously birds. Those are going to be our easiest yellow group because they're the most similar. On the other end of the spectrum, we have bat, kite, swift, and crane, which are most dissimilar, and those are going to be our purple group. We also have an editor agent that is kind of directly inspired by the way New York Times has said that they create their puzzles. And it's going to check that the group category actually makes sense for a set of 4 words. And if it doesn't make sense, it's going to be able to modify that category and also word it in a way that's more in line with the New York Times flavor. So for example, if we had this flying animals group, kite, swift, crane, but we also have bee in there. This actually might not be wrong. I don't think a bee is an animal, but assuming it's not, we can say, okay, well, this is wrong. It could be a good group if we just reword that category slightly. So our editor agent can call this category flying creatures instead. A bee is definitely a creature. And so we set this up. We have a couple other agents working on that I'm going to cut for time, but we create 4 sets of puzzles in order to test, AI generated connections puzzles. The first is a 1-step set. So this is a naive approach where we're generating an entire puzzle, all 4 groups, in a single prompt of the LLM. We have our intentional overlap set, which is where we tweak this slightly to make sure we have these overlapping meanings of groups. And then we have 2 false group sets. One is LLM. That means that the false group we're using to generate this puzzle was proposed by an LLM. And we also have the false group New York Times set, which is where we take a group from a real puzzle, and we're going to use those 4 words in our puzzle somehow. So we set up our experiment like this. Users get to go to an online survey. They answer a couple quick questions. And they play a clone of the connections game, which is implemented with the exact same rules and gameplay you would find on the New York Times website. And they're going to play 1 New York Times puzzle and 1 AI-generated puzzle head-to-head. Afterwards, they're going to answer 3 questions. They also have a free response section. One being, which puzzle do you think was more creative? Which puzzle was harder? And which puzzle did you like more overall? The options they can select are, puzzle 1, puzzle 2, or tied. So we collected 78 responses from 52 unique users. We encouraged users to complete it multiple times. And we found that AI-generated puzzles were roughly objective measures, we see that AI generated puzzles were roughly as hard as real puzzles, with all AI puzzles overall being solved 58% of the time, and New York Times puzzles being solved 69% of the time. But we see that there's significant differences in solve rate between these subsets or recipes we use to generate puzzles. You can see that intentional overlap puzzles are only being solved 31% of the time, while the false group with the New York Times groups are being solved 92% of the time. So looking at the actual responses to these questions we're asking the user, the way to read this chart is the gray bar is going to be cases where a user said that these puzzles were tied in this measure. And the colored bars are going to be cases where the user said our AI puzzle was strictly better in this measure. So looking at all AI generated puzzles as a whole, they were rated as better or tied with real New York Times puzzles around 50% of the time. But when we're looking at these differences between subtype, we see our naive approach, one-step puzzles, were generally rated as less enjoyable and creative than New York Times counterparts, but pretty similar in difficulty. Intentional overlap puzzles, which were significantly harder in terms of solve rate, were also rated as significantly harder, but they often tie in creativity and performance metrics. Our false group puzzles, where we have an LLM proposed false group, were rated as more difficult in the majority of sessions, and they were often preferred to New York Times puzzles overall, and rated as equally creative. The New York Times seeded false group puzzles were rated as significantly easier than New York Times puzzles. They often tie in creativity. This kind of makes sense given we're directly borrowing one of these groups from a real puzzle. And so finally, connections is a difficult domain for PCG because there are a lot of constraints that are hard to articulate in a written rule set. All these like intangible aspects and unspoken rules that aren't written down anywhere, but you kind of pick up as a player who plays this game every day. And the key to our success in this method was to break this task down into smaller steps. We're trying to leverage what an LLM does best, which is like simple and clear language-based tasks, trying to leverage its like very broad understanding of language. And kind of like a way to sum up this approach is to move our domain knowledge, not from within the prompt, but into the design of our generative pipeline overall. But this approach still requires humans in the loop. Like we haven't completely automated this game. But it's kind of acting at a higher level of abstraction as typical human in the loop approaches do. So we need to actually analyze and deduce the theory behind how these puzzles are generated from a very limited set of games. We only have one for every day it's been published since, I think, summer of last year. So this is a way of like framing procedural content generation research as design research into the design of the connections game. So we're showing that LLMs can be capable puzzle generators for the New York Times connections puzzle, with our AI generated puzzles being rated as on par with real New York Times puzzles. But we find that naive prompting is not enough. With creative usage of LLMs, we can't solve this. And different choices at the meta level result in distinct and different puzzle experiences. And we find that the LLM's language understanding can extend to clever wordplay, creating some really interesting word groups and connections between words that do serve as a challenge for human players. That's it. Here's my email and my Twitter.